Hello, friends, and good morning. Welcome to our second installation of the human faces of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, learning from those doing the work on the ground for a better society. For those who did not experience our first meeting with the young activists of Omdim B'Yachad standing together, it is available on Temple Beth Israel's YouTube page. Today's meeting we're also recording and we'll also make available to our members, although as we were just discussing, we probably will not publicly post to our YouTube page, though we will send out a link to members and those who have registered, because our participants, our presenters actually put themselves at some risk publicly speaking about their connections and their commitments. And we'll hear a little bit about that. Our presenters today are Shaul Judelman and Noor Awad from Roots Hudur. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Is it Judur? Judur. And Shorashim, all the same word in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. This is an organization of peacemakers based in the West Bank, Israeli settlers, Palestinians, who acknowledge each other's equal or legitimate claim to the land and strive to figure out ways to build a shared society together. They both have their own powerful personal story and vision. And I'm sure it's very different from what any of us are used to encountering in our mainstream media narratives here. So I am delighted to turn this over to Shaul and Noor, and I will do so starting now. I believe Shaul is going to open us, correct?
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Ruchi, and thank you to the community for hosting us. And we're all, I guess, used to being in Zoom for a while now. It's still not exactly the same thing as visiting in person, and we'd love to someday host your congregation if you're ever visiting. But in order to somehow, how many time differences and cultural differences there stand between us. Here it's night, there it's day. One simple device we have is actually, I'm just going to play a 2-minute trailer from a documentary film that came out about Roots. Kind of actually, it was a filmmaker who followed the first 2 or 3 years of the project. So it's like 2014, 15, 16, I think. And it's screened in Dak Aviv, like the Israeli documentary film festival, one of the big documentary film festivals here. It's just a way of just giving a little bit more multimedia perception of where we are. So I'm going to hopefully successfully share my screen and the audio. That's important. And let's see, here we go. Let me try to do this.
אנחנו נמצאים כאן באדמה של המשפחה שלי. כשבאתי לכאן והחלטתי להקים מרכז פלסטיני שלי אלימות. אני מצפה שיתקפו אותי גם בחברה שלי וגם באוכלוסייה של המתנחלים. אבל אני יודע, כל עוד שאנחנו לא מדברים עם הימין, השמאל לא יעשה שלום.
The first time I had heard someone talk about being in Israeli jail. Someone talking about suffering under occupation.
בזה שאני מכבד אותך, זה הכבוד שאני מכבד את עצמי כשאני מסתכל על עצמי בראי.
We believe that religion has to be part of the solution.
Allahu Akbar. Adonai hu Elohim.
יהודים ניצודים בארץ ישראל כמו חיות, ממש. פשוט צדים אותם, רואים רכב, איפה הם? איפה השותף, איפה האח?
אתה יושב על הכלכלה שלי, אתה יושב על הבית שלי, אתה יושב על הלב שלי, אבל לא כשותף.
האם אתה מוכן להודות שהישיבה שלך פה היא ישיבה של פשע? וממילא תגיד לי מבחינה פוליטית.
The Jewish people, that we own this land? We don't own this land. We belong to this land. Palestinian people also belong to this land.
אנחנו האחרונים בעולם שצריך לשבת אחד עם השני. באתי לבקש לדרוש איתה מחבר, מפני שאת ואני סבלנו שלא חיפשנו את זה לפני.
There we were. Some people, a cast of characters there. Oh, my video went off. What's happening? Now YouTube's playing. Technical difficulty, sorry about that.
We've got you back now.
Okay, YouTube started playing. So that cast of characters there in that 2 minutes of clip showing a lot of the people involved in the beginning of the project, Palestinian activist named Ali Abu Awad. You saw Rabbi Yaakov Meidan, who's kind of a very mainstream leader in the religious Zionist community. Elias Cohen, who's a dear activist in Roots and also a member of Two States, One Homeland, which is a new political model for work in Israel-Palestine. And the opening scene, it kind of is showing scenes of our center, which is located on a small piece of land, about a quarter of an acre, a square acre, just next to the Gush Etzion junction, which is a junction on Highway 60 that kind of transverses all of Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, north-south. And we're about halfway between Jerusalem and Hebron. So before we get into Roots, just myself and Noor, we're both very involved in the leadership of Roots. I have been from the beginning. Noor is already six years or so involved. And in doing these presentations, our goal is one to just share a bit of our perspective on how we see what's, I guess, the problem statement, what we've experienced and see as the conflict today, what's at stake, what's happening, what we've gone through, what we see is happening, how we got to this joint initiative, which obviously, as you'll hear, our stories, the world of Israeli settlers and Palestinian refugees working together is, in a sense, according to Oslo, the last two groups who could possibly work together, but also people, who are understanding the conflict, also understand deeply how those are two of the maybe core voices that were left out of peace, and even the reasons why peace didn't happen. So it's our conviction that Dafka, like specifically by starting by those narratives and stories and communities, is where the work needs to happen today. So Noor and I both will just kind of share both a personal story, and then we'll talk a little bit what Roots does, and then we'll open up for conversation. And Rabbi Ruchi, what's just time-wise? We didn't ask that before. Technical question. How time?
That's okay. On our end, we advertise this as going potentially until 1, so about an hour.
Okay.
And a half.
Great. Perfect. Great. Okay.
It's a late night for you guys if we do.
Okay. Had some coffee. We're ready to go. So I'll start just personally. Like I said, personal stories. That's how we start I statements. My name's Shaul Judelman. My family moved to the States actually when I was about 2, and I grew up in Seattle, Washington, just up I-5 from Eugene. I grew up in a conservative synagogue, a public school, and but I think always with a deep sense of connection back to Judaism in Israel. I wasn't a religious family, but I think being an immigrant to the U.S., Israel always, on some way, gave some backbone of identity of ultimately we're from there, and I didn't really know what that meant. But I knew, when I was, coming up to Hanukkah, maybe being a little kid playing, Maccabees fighting Greeks or whatever, and a sense that somewhere over the world, over there is where we're ultimately from. And in 1987, my uncle left Israel and lived with us for about a year when the first Intifada broke out, the first Palestinian uprising, the late 80s. I remember this being a kid watching the images when the Gulf War broke out and calling our cousins here, is everybody okay? I went to Israel in 1995. With USY, the U.S. Conservative Youth Program, had an amazing time, felt some deep sense of connection, knew I had to come back in a way when I could just be free to travel. When I was in university, my major, I had to do a semester abroad. And for me, it was just clear before I'm going to go visit Zambia, I should first come to Israel and understand more just what it means to be a part of this Jewish story, Jewish people. And by then also, I think I had a question kind of going, a little bit of exposure to Native American struggles in America and the United States, but being in touch with a culture that was grounded in their land, in their tradition, and in their people. I just really had this question: is there a Judaism like that? What is it? I know we're the people of the book, And there's many books on the bookshelves I can see around on everybody's screens and here too. But what happens when we take this people of the book and put them back in the land? What does that look like? Does Judaism change in Israel? Is it different? What's it like? And so I came really with that simple question. I ended up hearing about a kibbutz. That was both a religious kibbutz and I did organic farming, a place called Sde Eliyahu. And I arrived there in the summer of 2000. So it's 21 years ago. I was 21, about halfway points here. And when I got to the kibbutz, all excited to kind of learn Hebrew and work the land, the first thing they told me was the upcoming Rosh Hashanah, in about a month or two after I got there, was going to be a Shemitah year, the beginning of a Shemitah, a sabbatical year. And you know, with all that means, so for a religious kibbutz, that 80% of their incomes from agriculture, Shemitah is a really big deal. And the thought of not working the land, no income for a year, and so like most religious communities in Israel since the 1920s, every 7 years they look at the question, decide it's not really feasible, and they use the heter mechira. They sell the land nominally in order to sustain the economics. But by the year 2000, you know, Israel as a state can definitely export Intel processors, import some cucumbers, we'll be okay. And the kibbutz also did a kind of economic feasibility study, and so actually the kibbutz could actually survive Shemitah without working the land. And it's a religious obligation. Maybe this is the first year they should really actually keep the sabbatical. And that was one voice on the kibbutz. But then came a counter argument that said, really, that it's true, us kibbutz members, right, the seventh year, the commandment to let the land rest in the 7th year. And the real prohibition in Shemitah, I'll just make it clear, the real prohibition in the sabbatical year, it's not really about harvesting, it's really about profiting. The real prohibition in Shemitah is using the land, is using the fruits of the produce for profit and working the land, but harvesting is no problem. The land, right, is supposed to be onerous. Anybody who needs is supposed to be able to harvest. But when the kibbutz came to really think about it, they realized that who's going to suffer the most from us keeping the sabbatical year? It's the people we employ, that we work, that non-kibbutz members, they're not part of the economic collective of the kibbutz. And they said, if we don't have agriculture next year, we're going to lay those people off for a whole year. And to take away people's salaries, and the name of sabbatical is absolutely missing the point. It's a vision, really kind of a social justice vision of Shemitah, of haves and have-nots and equal. And the kibbutz decided yes to work the land, and even though it's sabbatical for that reason. And I was blown away. You know, sitting there fresh out of my own Jewish identity and grappling what does it mean to be a Jew? What is Judaism? And I always lived that question according a lot to my own personal decision of if I'm going to keep kosher or not keep kosher, my family's traditions, my synagogue, my community's conditions. But when I heard that the way the kibbutz made that decision, that religious decision to keep the mitzvah or not, it was a totally different calculation. It was about their sense of economic. It was economics. It was hard economics. And for me, Shemitah kind of really rebooted a whole lot of my thinking about what is Israel. And a word that I'd grown up with a certain definition to that point meant something. It radically changed. And that word was Zionism. You know, if Zionism for many generations, several generations, was the movement for our Jewish people to take our destiny in our own hands, move back to our homeland and recreate a Jewish life there where we can be safer. We did that. We're here. Year 2000 back then. We had economies doing pretty well, countries flourishing in many ways. But now, what does it mean, Zionism now? And the meeting on the kibbutz, because like I said, the Shemitah, sabbatical for me wasn't just another mitzvah. It was really a Jewish take on a just economy. It was an economic model, a balancing of capitalism and socialism, and 6 years of this, 7 years of that, and the question of how we as the project, the question of how we as an Israeli society design our economy and take from our Jewish inspiration and apply that in a way was a very powerful story to live in. And that's my Zionism. That's my built with that project of creating a state here, that a state and a society that live up to our highest hopes and visions of what our Jewish society can be, and not on the level of just individual or community, but on the way I think the Torah describes as a people in their land, which means a state and all these wonderfully messy things we got to get involved with. So after a few months on kibbutz, I moved down to study more about Judaism. I ended up moving down to Gush Etzion, where I live today, in the Gush between Jerusalem and Hebron, in the southern West Bank, and studying in a yeshiva, a seminary there called Bat Ayin. But if I go back to Rosh Hashanah, I go back to the Rosh Hashanah that begins the Shemitah year. We had the holiday off from the kibbutz, so I actually traveled to Jerusalem for the holiday, Rosh Hashanah 2000. And I remember getting off the bus at the old bus station in Yerushalayim and just hearing sirens and ambulances and helicopters and every which uniform of the security forces all streaming down to the old city. And right 2 days before Rosh Hashanah, right, the Oslo Peace Accords had gone to the Camp David negotiations and had really fallen apart. Ehud Barak came back and said, there's no partner for peace. Arafat walked out. So there's a Palestinian version of that, which is different, but that was the story we heard. And in the midst of that, one of the core issues in this conflict, of course, is Jerusalem and what's going to be with Jerusalem. And Ariel Sharon, who's in the opposition of the government, said, as a Knesset member, I have the right to go to Jerusalem. It's part of Israel. It's the old city, the Temple Mount. And he went there, and obviously people tried to tell him not to go, but he went with about 150 security guards. And all hell broke loose, right? The second Intifada kind of was snapped in that moment. And I got to Jerusalem that afternoon and hearing all the sirens going. I got to my friend's house. He'd come back from visiting his uncle in the hospital. He said, there's wounded, there's killed. The bus ride back to kibbutz, when Rosh Hashanah finished, I remember that we got stopped on the road because there were shots fired. The next 5 months when I was still on kibbutz, I was in Ulpan, like learning Hebrew. And every morning we'd turn on the radio and write down the words on the radio. And every morning the radio broadcast was, suicide bombing, wounded, shot, killed. Same feeling we felt this morning, though, turning on the news again and hearing, and really the way it is now for me, I think, and for anybody who was of age in that generation and before, but as soon as you hear the sirens, as soon as you hear the radio broadcast, it sets you back into this trauma cycle of again and again. There's the stabbing on Thursday night, there's the shooting this morning, 24-year-old boy killed. And all of those feelings that violence comes up, kind of sets off, and you wonder, is it going to happen again? Is it going to happen again? You're just waiting for the next broadcast and the next news. So, second Intifada breaks out. The hopes of Oslo largely, for many of us, changed. And here I'll get a little bit more political. I'll say, why was I sharing these stories about Shemitah? Because that story of Zionism, of what this land means, of what a state means, are really, in the end of the day, deep parts of the political question in Israel-Palestine. These collective identities and collective stories, what does it mean? Why not just one state? Why need two states? Or why not two states? All those things come back to things that are really deep parts of our stories as Israelis and Jews and Palestinians. And but yeah, I have moved down to Gush Etzion and started studying. And I spent the next 6 years in Batayin in the yeshiva and throughout the second Intifada. And really my views start changing a lot. I grew up a nice progressive Jewish guy from Seattle. Two states make sense. There's two nations here. We have to compromise. And but that, and like everybody else, I kind of have this analysis where I think that anybody who looks at this conflict, either from abroad or from up close, Israeli, Palestinian, sees it in a dichotomy of one of either two perspectives. The one perspective was how I grew up, was of course the sense, learning Israeli history and 48 war and 29 riots, 6-day war and Yom Kippur war, Lebanon, Intifada, and finally came that moment in the early 90s to see Rabin and Arafat put their hands together, these two leaders of struggle and survival, and say enough is enough. It's time to move on. It's time to compromise, look to the future, not to the past, land for peace, everything we like to say, all the slogans, and the peace process is born. Now, that was 1983, 28 years later, this peace process that many people still hold on to as something we need to support. But imagine you're an Israeli or Palestinian living the last 28 years of peace process. What have you seen, received? If you're a Palestinian, you know that before the peace process, you didn't need a permit from the IDF to take your kids to go to the beach in Jaffa. You took your kids and drove. There was no apartheid wall, security barrier, separation wall that wasn't here before the peace process. Is occupation gone now that there's a peace process? No. If you're an Israeli, you look on the peace process and you think, well, when was the first suicide bombing in this land? It was in 1993. We didn't have suicide bombings before the peace process. Before the peace process, there were sometimes rockets from the northern border with Hezbollah and Lebanon. After this peace process, we can now have Hamas that can shut down a third of our country with rockets and missiles being shot at. From Syria, we have Iran coming in, from Lebanon, sometimes from Sinai. What peace process? And who's our partner for peace? Here, I also want to zoom in who this conflict is between. Oh, and I hope many of us assume that the conflict is between Israelis and Palestinians. And that's what most of the articles are about. The Arab-Israeli war, the Arab-Jewish war, the Israeli-Palestinian. But living it, it's not, Israelis and Palestinians is too abstract. There's a group here called us, and there's a group here called them. That line is in the stone. You know, my car has a yellow license plate on it. When I drive through a Palestinian village, if they're throwing rocks, they throw rocks at the yellow cars, at the cars with the yellow license plates. It doesn't matter. If you're driving in a Palestinian and you walk by the same place, the same soldiers that make me feel secure, they're going to make you feel not secure because you're Palestinian, us and them. But peace process means that amongst that them, there's somebody recognizing us and somebody amongst us recognizing them, and we're transcending that. We're building a partnership across that. But today you look across the aisle and what do you see? You know, Israel signed with the Palestinian, from the Palestinian, the PLO came Fatah party. It's our major partner for peace. And I don't know if you've ever visited on the Facebook page for Fatah, for instance. Fatah is the major Palestinian, it's Yasser Arafat, President Abbas, Abu Mazen. It's the more secular party that's holding the security agreements with us. But at the same time, if you go to their Facebook pages or hear their rhetoric, it doesn't sound like they have any iota of recognition or acknowledgement of anything Jewish being legitimate in this land. Meanwhile, many Palestinians, of course, listen to Israeli politicians who they'll hear over and over claiming that there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. It's a lie. So can you really make peace with somebody who won't even say your name or won't even recognize your core legitimacy? So this seems like there's no partner. And if there's no partner, there's no peace process. I think by 2008, 2009, I don't see here a peace process. And here we can all struggle to define what exactly is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is a religious conflict or an ethnic conflict or a nationalist struggle or a territorial battle. Who cares? What it feels like for many of us in our kishkas is a deep sense of existential struggle, a very deep feeling of fear, of older national traumas that are being played out here again. But a real sense that if we were to give an inch, we don't know what, like I'll talk about my cousins who live not in the West Bank, they live in Israel proper, they're secular, they really could care less about holding on to Hebron for eternity. But they're terrified to create a Palestinian state 3 kilometers from Kfar Saba. And to pull out and to be that threatened. And the next, look what happened in Gaza. We pulled out and Hamas, who's to say Hamas wouldn't take over the West Bank? There's plenty of things going on in the Middle East that seem to point that way. So that existential fear that holds us in place is very powerful. And that sense of survival. And we've all been betrayed by all the other nations of the world, Palestinians and Israelis alike. That feeling of being in a corner. And one more thing to add to the analysis, I'd say, is why did my views change? Why did I go from being somebody who thought, of course, we need peace, it's an ultimate value, and compromise is real, to somebody who says, over my dead body, you're not taking out of my home. I don't think it was about becoming more religious. I don't think it was about officially signing on to some kind of right-wing ideology or something like that. I think the conflict is much more human. I look back on my own process. It was that first time getting rocks out of me, the first time getting shot at, the first time a friend was killed, the first time searching for a body, not the first time burying a body again. And each one of those experiences brings fear, brings anger, like very real raw emotions. And you know, when the siren goes off and you live in the south of this country and you have 10 or 20 or 50 or 70 seconds to grab your kids at 2 in the morning and run to a bomb shelter, you could be the most anti-occupation Israeli in the world. You experience a very real fear at that moment. And so I say fear and anger are kind of the cores of this conflict for the people who end up voting and for the people who end up choosing and deciding what's the right thing to do. And I have a simple equation that says fear plus anger equals hate. And when I hear young Israelis or Palestinians talking about their hate, you know, speaking hatefully about the other, I don't judge them. I think I understand, I get where that comes. That's pretty clear where that came from. It's not pretty, it's not nice. We have to change it, but it's important to recognize where it stems from. And that was me, 2010, ready to fight, no compromise. There's no partner for peace. We tried peace. Look what we got. Bus bombs in Haifa and Afula. And in 2010, there was an attack in my town. It was a very brutal attack. And I remember that anger, that livid anger afterwards, about the people who would do this to a boy. And a few months later, I was sitting on Shabbat reading a commentary on the Parsha. And in the commentary, I quoted from the Gemara in the Talmud, where it says, "Kol hakoes ki'ilu oved avodah zarah." That anyone who gets angry, it's like they're worshiping an idol. Anger is like idolatry. And it hit me because I could feel that anger. And they say one of the reasons why we grow our peyot is to keep our head connected down to our heart. So if you intellectually read a piece about anger and you have anger in your heart, then that give me work to do. And the commentary went on and said, anger like idolatry has no place in the camp of Israel. And now I understand that in the society of Israel. That anger has no place in being a part of how we view things, decide things as a aspiring holy Jew. I can't let that anger decide for me things. And it was voting for me. It was deciding things. And so that was a kind of an emotional stop. And I really think that when engaging, talk about the conflict, there's an emotional level that every single person here has that has to be addressed, like, or touched or accepted or heard or expressed before we can move on. The other person who started standing in front of me was my rabbi. It was, I'll show a little picture, prop. It says Rabbi Menachem Froman, of Menachem. He was a dear teacher and left the world about 9 years ago. The Rabbi Fruman, I can put a link in the chat afterwards. He was really a distant, incredible, kind of transcending paradox person. And I was first drawn to him because his ability in bridging the secular religious divide in Israel was just something else. And I have lots of stories to tell, but I want to respect time. So I'll share one story that really touches on what we're talking about here. And in 1976, they founded a kibbutz in Gush Etzion, a settlement called Migdal Oz. And Rabbi Fruman was part of Gush Emunim, the block of the faithful, but really the ideological religious movement to recreate Jewish life after the Six-Day War, and really after the Yom Kippur War and kind of that trauma in Israeli society, to go back and resettle the land, to come back and build in Hebron and in Gush Etzion and Hara, Judea and Samaria. And he was invited with his wife Hadassah and their two kids to be the rabbi in Migdal Oz. And Hadassah, his widow, who's also in the leadership of Roots, told me this story many years later. She said, when we got to the kibbutz, there was a few caravans on the hilltop, and we were going to go into our home, and they're going to take a picture of us entering our house. Hadassah says, when I walked into that house, this is 1976, this is 3 years after the Yom Kippur War, 30 years after the Holocaust. She said, I walked into that house with there's no peace treaty with Jordan or Egypt. She said, I walked into that house with a sense of stepping into the next chapter of Jewish history, being a part of history, the next chapter in history. And she said, but when I turned around, I saw Menachem, my husband, was standing outside the door, not coming in. And she said, Menachem, come in. They're waiting. Take the picture. We're home. On the most epic 2,000 years of history, we're home. And he said, I can't go in this house. She said, what do you mean? And he pointed to the door, and she went outside and looked at the door. He was pointing at a sticker, and she looked in the door. On the door, there was just a bumper sticker. It's a slogan of the movement. It says, Eretz Yisrael Shayach L'Am Yisrael, that the land of Israel belongs to the people of Israel. She said, Menachem, what do you mean you can't go? That's why we're here. And he says, no. She says, what do you want me to take down the sticker in front of all these people? They'll laugh at you. He says, don't take it down. And he played with the sticker, and he rearranged the words to say what I told that group of high school students in the clip in the beginning of the movie. The people of Israel belong to the land of Israel. But the land doesn't, not that the land belongs to us, but our people belong to this land. And Rabbi Fruman was a very devout, incredibly devout. I've never met a person who actually believed in God like Rabbi Fruman, like a belief that was real. And in the morning, when I wake up in the morning, I say, Modeh ani lefenecha. I acknowledge to you, God, that but this body you've given me. And Rabbi Fruman made no distinction between that and this land that God's given, and that this belonging of this story. And he used to say that it's true that we belong here. And it's also true that the Palestinians belong here. And look at history. Christianity belongs in this land. Islam belongs in this land. But if we can change this Israeli-Palestinian back and forth about whose this land is it really Israel? Is it really who was here first? Who was da-da-da? And just understand God's truth, that God's brought both these peoples here. Both these stories belong here. Maybe that's a new vision of how we can move forward. And for me, that's a deep evolution of my Zionism. And instead of needing to deconstruct Palestinian claims here, I need to accept them. understand, because that's God's work in my eye. And so all of a sudden, horizons opened. And through Rabbi Fruman, Rabbi Fruman, if you look him up, you'll see he was also very, he became a close confidant of Arafat, of Yasser Arafat. He met with Hamas leadership over and over again. In fact, the founding sheikh of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, said to Rabbi Fruman, what happened in Oslo? He said, your heretics and my heretics signed a piece of paper. But you and I, Chacham Fruman, could make peace in 5 minutes. So here's a settler rabbi and a Hamas sheikh talking about a peace, and that conversation intrigued me. And so not just that, but Rabbi Fruman was active. He was reaching out to Palestinian leadership, Muslim leadership. And on the ground here too, we started reaching out and meeting Palestinians in this area and asking the question where this conflict is stuck. Oslo's failed us. We're living in a sense worse than what it was before. And with a generation now that's only known separation and fear from each other. Is there new political paradigms? What does it mean to take responsibility? All of a sudden we start asking those questions and we start acting. And when there's settler violence, we start showing up to a mosque that was burned to say this is a crime. And whoever did this is no place in Holy Land. We start talking to the army, we start meeting Palestinians. And about 7-8 years ago, somebody introduced us to the Abu Awad family, Ali and Khalid Abu Awad, who are a family of Palestinian leaders, of national leaders from the PLO, refugees, to the First Intifada, into the Fatah party. And they challenged us, and we challenged them. And since that's how I got to Roots, since was meeting that Palestinian voice. And at first, I think I just came across an old article when about Roots, and I described Ali as how did I remember I said it, but these are the Palestinians that I was always afraid existed. Palestinians who are serious about peace, Palestinians who recognize us, Palestinians who are active in their own society to build something. Because if there really is something like that, then we'd actually really have to come to terms. And at first I was afraid of that because it threatened my story, but now I recognize it's as we say in the Gemara, it's chavruta or metuta. It's either partnership or death. Either we work towards peace or work towards war. And so Roots for me is kind of the place to do that work, and the process of learning from each other constantly. And so I'm going to pass over to Noor. This has been one of my great teachers and partners, and also now a good friend. But thank you. I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you, Shaul. Hello, everyone. My name is Noor Awad, and I'm a member of Roots. I have been at Roots now for like 6 years, almost 6 years. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself and how I joined Roots. So I was born in Amman, Jordan, in 1991. I was born there for a Palestinian family. But I usually say that my story started before I was born. It started in 1948. In 1948, my family used to live in a village southwest of Jerusalem, a small village called Malha that still exists until today. And in Malha, basically, the people of my village found themselves forced to leave their village after a massacre occurred in the next village, which is called Deir Yassin. After that massacre, my grandparents left the village and went into a refugee camp a few miles in the direction of Bethlehem to the south. My grandparents stayed in the refugee camp, and they hoped that soon they can go back to their homes, to their village. But the war ended with a ceasefire agreement that made or established the ceasefire line, where they were allowed to go back to their homes because Malha became part of the state of Israel, and where they live in the West Bank was occupied by Jordan. So my grandfather left the refugee camp. He took his family, wife, his kids, and moved out of the refugee camp. And since then, we live here in Bethlehem. But my parents, who were born in Bethlehem, by 1980s, both of them actually left Palestine. They felt that there is no hope for them to stay here, and there is no future. So that's why they wanted to move somewhere else where they can establish a new life, where they can have a better life. That's why my parents went to Jordan, and that's why I was born there. In 1995, during the Oslo peace process, for the first time, my parents actually started to think about coming back. They hear that they are now talking about soon the occupation will end, and soon there will be an independent Palestinian state. And that hope brought them back to Palestine. We came back in 1995, and let me tell you that when I remember those years, my first years here, I don't remember so much of the conflict. Most of what I remember, most of what I lived was what I describe a normal life. My father used to work in Jerusalem. At the weekend, on a Friday, for example, he used to take me with him there. It used to be easy. We didn't have to have a permission to cross. He used to take me to the mosque, to Al-Aqsa, in the old city. In the weekends, we used to go to the beach, to Jaffa. And that's how I remember life. I'm not saying that there was no conflict. I'm not saying that the occupation disappeared in those years. But how I felt and how I was, as I described, a normal life comparing to what happened after. Because with the year 2000, Shaul was touching, the second intifada and how it affected his life. At the year 2000, the peace process that was supposed to bring the end of the occupation and to bring a Palestinian state failed to do so. So I found myself growing up in a war zone. Bethlehem was besieged by the Israeli military for more than 40 days. And for several months, there was fights and shooting. And my father lost his job in Jerusalem. Economically, we were devastated, and the situation was very, very difficult. And by the end of the second intifada, I lost a friend who was shot and killed by Israeli soldiers during clashes. So that's how I grew up. This is the atmosphere of the intifada that I grew up in. I start to think more about, by the end of the second intifada, I start to think more about myself and my reality and the future. And I ask myself simply a question: do I see for myself a future here? Do I see for myself a life? And how I felt about it, the answer was no. I will never have a normal life here. And the reason why is because of who I am and where I live. I'm a Palestinian. But what does it mean? It meant for me, it felt like I'm going to continue this story of suffering that my grandparents and my parents lived. And I'm doomed to continue it because I'm living here. I'm living in Palestine, so I have to leave. That's what I said to myself. And on the other hand, I had this idea this question where I asked myself, can I do anything about the situation to change it? Yes, I didn't choose the situation. I don't like it, but can I do anything about it? And do I have a responsibility toward this situation? And the answer for me was yes, I have a responsibility to it. I can blame the past generations. I can blame the enemy for what we are going through, what we are living. But at the end of the day, I have a responsibility. I have a duty to change the situation. That's how I felt. And I start to think how. And how I grew up and the perspective that I carry with me for most of my life is that because we are very weak and we are unable to defend ourselves, we are occupied by them, we are occupied by the Israelis, and that's why we are not living a normal life. Therefore, we have to fight against this occupation, we have to resist. And for me, the idea of resistance is connected always to violent resistance, because that's what will be practical, that's what will work out, that's how nations get their independence, that's how you build your country. You fight the occupation. And I thought of that, and I thought of violent resistance. I practiced violent resistance. And at some point, I learned about non-violent approaches. Palestinians who are taking nonviolent approaches in resistance against occupation. And I also did that. And one of the reasons why I wanted to become a tour guide later is because I saw it as a nonviolent way of resisting the occupation by guiding foreigners here and show them the land and talk to them about the history and the reality that we live. But the point here is that whether I'm resisting the occupation violently or not, I'm not actually doing that in any partnership with Israelis. The Israeli role here, the Israelis are only represented by the army, the soldiers, the occupation, and the idea of settlers. I didn't really meet settlers. There are few, let's say, negative interactions between settlers and Palestinians in the West Bank. And I see settlers on the news when I read about them building a new settlement and taking more of our land. So that's how the Israelis were in my life. This is the Israeli. He's a soldier. He's the occupation. And one day in 2016, when I was guiding a group of American students here in the West Bank, in the area of Hebron, I was taking them, and I basically took them to the city of Hebron, and I was asked to show them around there and to guide them and to explain to them about the situation in Hebron. And I remember that we met with a settler there, which wasn't something usual that I do. After we met with Palestinian families living there, we met with this Israeli settler who's going to talk to us about Israeli settlers in Hebron and what do they think, why they are there. And when we met with him, he talked to us about his personal story. He was born in the US. He had a good life, and he decided to move to Israel, and he wanted to live here in the occupied territories in the city of Hebron. And he wanted to convey two messages to my group. The first message was that there is no occupation today because the presence of the Jewish people here is an implementation to the return of the Jewish people to this land. And this implementation cannot be described as occupation. And the first time I heard that, I was shocked. How can someone actually deny the occupation? Now, I call myself a Palestinian, and I live in Area A in Bethlehem under the Palestinian Authority that was established here since 1995, part of the Oslo Peace Accords. But me and the Palestinian Authority, we live under the Israeli military rule at the end of the day. There is no Palestinian sovereignty here in any way. And this guy says to me that what I go through in my life, what affects my life on the macro level and the micro level, the occupation doesn't exist. It's not there. And the other thing he said, the other idea was, which I was familiar with actually, that there is no Palestinian people. There is no such thing. And I'm saying I was familiar with that because, yes, this is what I learned in my school. This is what I hear before. This is what's the ideology of the Zionist movement. This is what it's all about, to deny and to erase our history and connection to this land. So I wasn't shocked when I heard him saying that, but I felt this sense of denial and frustration from listening to him. And I left Hebron very angry and frustrated. But I said, yeah, this is what my group needed to listen to because this is what they think on the other side. This is what they believe. On the way back to Bethlehem, I stopped for a last meeting, and that was at Roots. And simply, I had no idea what Roots actually was. I thought we were meeting with another settler from the area of Gush Etzion, halfway between Bethlehem and Hebron, who's going to talk to us about the life in Gush Etzion and about the settlers there. But it turned out to be that this Israeli activist who's going to talk to us is a member of an initiative called Shurashim, Roots, Judur, that actually brings Palestinians and Israeli settlers to the table and to the dialogue, talking about peace. And when I hear that, I didn't know, like, I couldn't really understand what do they mean. How could it be that there are settlers sitting with us talking about peace? It can't be. And I came to this initiative because I wanted to meet the Palestinians who dared sit with settlers and talking about peace. That's how I felt. I was angry on the Palestinians who are doing that, because I didn't believe that there are Israeli settlers who are doing this work. So I came to this initiative, and we met with Rav Hanan. He was the only person there waiting for us. He talked to my group. He shared with us his personal story. And at the beginning, it was very difficult to listen to him talking about himself as a Zionist and as a Jew and as a settler. And the way how he described these things, this terminology, as the pillars of his identity, I was again frustrated, and I said to myself, what do you expect from him? Of course, he will not talk about 1948. He will not talk about the occupation. Stop waiting for that, and maybe just leave. You don't have to stay here listening to this again and again. So I wanted to leave the meeting actually, but I didn't. I sat and listened to what he said until the end, even though it was really difficult to me. But it was really interesting because he started to talk about the reality. He told us his story of meeting with Palestinians, of coming to certain realizations and asking himself very serious questions about his identity and about his beliefs after meeting with us, and talking about this concept of multiple truths, that the truth does not only exist on his side. Truth also exists on my side, on our side. And at the end of his talk, I didn't feel that I am being denied. I felt that I'm being recognized, and more than that, I'm being empathized with. This empathy and recognition that Hanan showed me that day, and he brought this discussion, affected me so much. I went back to Bethlehem and I couldn't just forget about it. And I said to myself, this Hanan person is a very unique person. He's, only one, he's a phenomenon. But I wanted to come back because he says that there's a movement, there's an organization, and there are other people like him doing this work. And I came back and I met with Shaul and Myron and Ali and Khalid and Wajih and other activists. And I remember sitting with Ali for hours and listening to him talking about his experience in peace building and meeting with Israeli left-wing activists and talking about roots and the importance of roots. And I decided to join. I joined because I felt that roots is actually talking about and working on the core and the heart of the conflict. At the end of the day, when we look at the conflict here, yes, we have, we didn't really talk about politics so far. We have border issues. We have issues over resources. We have issues over land. We have a conflict because of the occupation. We have Gaza issue. We have the violence and terrorism. We have all of these things. The core of this conflict is our identities. Until this is solid, we cannot really have peace in this land. Until we find a formula of reconciliation between the Palestinian national identity and the Jewish national identity here, there can't be peace. So, and I agree with that. It's not only about 1967, it's about 1948 and more than that. So we have to find a solution to the conflict. And that's what basically Roots is doing. Roots is trying to find this reconciliation between two identities that belong to the same land. And I joined Roots since then. Thank you.
So I think before we move over to questions, open up conversation as much as possible on the format. both Noor and I shared from a lot of the thinking, I guess, and how we got here. I'll say just a word about what Roots does on a practical level. That really the base of our work is in bridge building and reducing violence, conflict between Israelis and Palestinian communities. We started in Gush Etzion, the Bethlehem kind of Hebron area about 7-8 years ago. We have a center there, a piece of land. It's a farm owned by private Palestinian farmland. And there I think I divide Roots' activities into 3 fields, 3 different kinds of work. One is people-to-people meeting. Israelis and Palestinian kids here are not going to meet each other playing soccer or playing basketball, or they're not until they're 18 at the checkpoint, in a sense. So making a space where those encounters can happen between either local, we have worked between local religious leaders, Roots Women's Group at today. We have a young adults program for 16 to 18-year-olds, about 35, 40 each year's cohort. We've had 5 cohorts, but now that we have an alumni network, about 130 Israelis and Palestinian alumni. Summer camps, women's we found that photography is a great way of bringing people together when they don't have a common language. So the women photography workshops, my daughters now and our young adults, like our 10 to 13-year-olds, all this work of people-to-people work, lectures about issues that are important to each other's side. What does Zionism mean for Israelis? What does Palestinianism mean for Palestinians? What's the place of religion? What is your religion? And all this work fits into the category of people-to-people work, and that's really important. There's not really another place in the entire West Bank where that stuff is going on between Israelis and Palestinians. But of course, it's not going to end the conflict. In fact, its effect is very personal, in addition to the statement, though, that it makes to our societies. The next work that Roots takes on is about activism or solidarity. When there's an attack, to go visit victims. For Israelis to hear that there's Palestinians against the violence against us is something they don't hear. For Palestinians to hear that there's Israeli settlers working for Palestinian rights, if it's building rights, if it's opening transportation or access to farmlands, if it's visiting victims who are attacked. There's also definitely the homework. A lot of Roots work is joined. A lot of it's also is Israelis involved with Roots trying to change things vis-a-vis the military right now. Of course, settler violence, settler youth, and that kind of stuff. Doing work within our communities to try to bring up voices against that, to try to think how to really work on the problem from its roots, not just from the enforcement level. And then the part what I think is also very important that happens at Roots is this third field, which I call discourse, generating discourse around the conflict. A new way of examining, understanding these identities, of bringing these identities face to face. And to that end, I think a lot of the Israelis and Palestinians involved in Roots have been not afraid to go to those full conversations, those hard conversations. And that we try to share with talks, people from abroad, of course, but also talks here. We host over several thousand Israeli students before they go to the army. Noor, myself, and others involved in kind of various kind of new think tanks, bridging insights, expanding the imagination of peace, different kind of Israelis and Palestinians trying to reconstruct the peace process, to kind of learn the lessons from Oslo, look at our societies and see what can be a better way forward. And I'll just close by saying we started here in this region about 5 years ago. We started a second branch down in the Jordan Valley, Jericho area. We have a group there also Israelis and Palestinians in the same work, both people-to-people work, intervening. And then in the northern part, in the Samaria, by Nablus, Ariel, we have another a dialogue group that's been going on for about 1.5 years, and it's kind of just starting to now to really pick up. And so this is our kind of work, belief in using very locally based projects to address the big issues, but also to give people a chance to do something and make impact on a local level in their communities. So we've spoken a lot, and we're happy to really receive any question. I'm not sure what the best way to do this is. If you want to raise hands or make a note in the chat.
And I'm happy to moderate the queue. Thank you both, Noor and Shaul. If people want to you can hit the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, or if you don't see a reactions button, you can hit more and you might see a reactions button, and then raise hand is an option as one of the reactions, and that will start a queue. If you can't figure out how to do that, you're also welcome to type a question in the chat, and I will keep my eye on the chat as well. I wanted to start with a question just about how this work is received in your communities. The trailer you showed, I think it was one of the Awads talking about how, they're targeted by the settlers and targeted by your own community. And And the trailer also showed Shaul, you talking to a group of youth and didn't show anything about their response to what you were saying. So can you share a little bit about how that is going and what progress looks like?
Sure. One, I think one I'll say like a roots kind of guiding principle is our job is to impact our communities, to make change within our communities, and not to be disregarded by them. Like maintaining the trust of our communities is something I think is really critical, because I think a lot of the peace movements, in a sense, has lost the trust of their communities. They're seen as naive or not understanding what it's about. So having a lot of humility in how we turn to things, that means being sensitive to where our societies are, and just a simple recognition: Israeli and Palestinian society are in totally different places. Different political standings, of course, the asymmetries, what's possible on the Israeli side, what's possible to publicize, and trying to respect that and constantly kind of walk. For instance, today we got a Israeli television, Channel 11 wanted to do a piece about us. Which is, great, amazing that the news channels they want to do a Saturday night special about roots. I said, really, it's not such a good idea. we can't do it. Because the sensitivities on the project, and I'd rather manage those things about meeting people face to face, where we can see them and they can see us, than having it get cast this way by a newscaster. That said, the growth, and so it's about, so on the one hand, it is about pushing our communities. It's about, so for instance, obviously, if you're going to talk in a Palestinian context, you're talking about ending the occupation. But if I'm talking in Tekoa or in Israeli communities here about what we're doing, ending the occupation for them generally is assumed as meaning no more Jewish communities here. So that's not a good word to start. That's not the easy word to start off the conversation with. But I often say, but I can explain to my neighbors things that my Palestinian partners are telling me, and they'll know that it's wrong. They'll say that it has to stop. There must be a better way to do this. And then I'll say, well, that's when they say occupation, that's a lot of what they're talking about. So I think it's about finding the way to bring these issues out to our communities in a way that they can hear. Also, a lot of things that Noor and I both have learned about tactically how to go about it. And for me, I've realized that instead of me telling my neighbors how wrong we are, how this has to change, really my job is for them to hear it firsthand, looking eye to eye from a Palestinian, telling their life story. Because there's something very different that happens to you when you hear something in a person's face-to-face story than being kind of batted on the head with things. So that's something I've learned about how to go about it tactically. In terms of growth, right? And I think also recognize there's certain people we're never going to be able to really reach. There's some people, this is a simple conflict. There's no great, but my sense is that there's a lot of I don't want to say silent majorities, but there's a lot of people in the middle who if you approach them the right way, you get surprised by who's open to come. So for me, it's really about engaging that, kind of making a space for those moderate voices here, even in the settlements. I know there's an image of what the settlements are, the image of what a refugee camp is. But when you zoom in, you see there's a lot of pretty normative people there with their fears, with their suspicions, with their beliefs. But there's a way to opening those gates some way if we go about it from someone that they trust, from people that they believe, that they know on a local basis. It's somehow about accessing, kind of bypassing some of those kind of trigger words or landmines in the way.
Thank you. Noor, are you willing to that question as well?
Yeah, I mean, obviously what we are doing here is going against the grain of what this is what most people actually in my head think, that what we are is not going really to bring anything or impact the reality. Many people would think that this is a form of normalization. Normalization is a terminology that's used here to describe joint activities and joint meetings. All of these activities are not going to bring the end of the occupation, but they are trying just to from my experience at Roots, I found out that many people on my side who are very curious, and this curiosity brings them to Roots. There is something that Shaul said of me, basically I will not be able to convince them or change their minds about the other side. But when they come and meet Israelis and talk to them and then through their own process, and they start to widen their perspective, change their ideas about the other side, and that's how it happens. And Shaul talked also about like the limits of publicity. Like sometimes there are things that we cannot go too public on it, or we cannot talk about it. The time is not suitable or right to talk about it now because of the political, because of what's going on, and yeah, that's what I wanted to say mostly.
I'd say two things also about that. I think we have to really lower the bar in the peace camp, lower the entrance bar. I think there's we need to be people need to be able to come with the issues that they have and not feel they're being immediately judged for how they think and who they are and what their opinions are. They need to be able to come in and express that. And a lot of times the roots we see, if it's for a Palestinian needs to come there and tell Israelis what they think about them, and not feel that they have to be speaking polite language and vice versa. So that's important. And so a short anecdote on last Thursday night, Khaled and I were speaking to an Israeli high school group, and there's about 70 high schoolers from an area called Beit Sha'an. They weren't peacenik kids, let's say that, put it that way. And in the middle of during the presentation, Khaled told a story about a way that an Israeli soldier mistreated him when he went to go to say him good morning many years ago in the early 80s. And one of the students stood up. Am I frozen? Ruchi, am I frozen?
We can see it. We can hear you and see
you. Can hear me? Okay. I just for some reason I felt like okay. And after Khaled told the story, an Israeli student, a girl in the class from the class stood up and she started almost smiling at first, but kind of screaming at Khaled. What do you expect of that soldier? You go up to say hello. You think he's supposed to be your friend and say hello, good morning back to you? And as she was talking, she started, you think you suffered? My grandfather was murdered by one of you. Went on and on. And he says, who are you that are teaching 16-year-olds to go stab soldiers? That could be me or you. And she went on and on, crying, started crying, and it was a very powerful exchange. It was very real, and we kept talking, and and understanding where did this come from? Like, it was seemingly a nice conversation. Where did this all come from? And I realized that 3 hours before, the group had been visiting the old city in Jerusalem. And in the old city in Jerusalem that afternoon, there had been a stabbing where a young Palestinian took a knife and stabbed 2 soldiers. So for her, she felt that could have been me. If I would have been standing where that soldier was, he would have stabbed me. And I think that's the thing. That's a feeling that every Israeli and Palestinian has here. If Noor would have been in that place, it would have been him. It would have been him and not the other boy who was killed. If I would have been there, it would have been me that was killed. So the level that the how close the conflict and the violence and the trauma then feels, it's like everybody's going. So for me, when I think how to bring roots out, I have to know that most of my clientele, that's where they're coming from, and I need to be respectful of that. And that's peace. That's the challenge of peace building in an Israeli-Palestinian conflict after 50 years of occupation and just getting worse, and Gaza wars and suicide bombings and stab, et cetera, et cetera. That's really where the societies are, and that's why I go back to that. So that's I think really much. We try to bring it in a way that respects that, and maybe that's how we manage to, whatever successes we have is about really holding true to that, that respect, that kind of respect for the conflict, the pain that's there. Okay, I promise not every answer will be that long.
Well, that brings up, I think, you talk about the trauma your communities hold that you're trying to reach. But that trauma is real for you as well. And I think about the fact that here you are speaking to us after a day in which there was a shooting attack in Jerusalem at the end of a day, which is probably going to have some, terrible traumatic consequences for Israeli Jews as well as Palestinians in the way that reaction unfolds. And how do the two of you, how do Roots manage to metabolize that trauma that is, it's not like we're talking about dealing with the trauma of past events. It continues to accrue. for both of
Yeah.
you, your families and communities.
So actually, we have actually roots right now going on, like a trauma workshop, a joint trauma workshop about Israelis and Palestinians. It's there's a Palestinian and Israeli facilitator. But I'd say sometimes it hits very close, and some certain attacks hit even closer. But I think there's a very just powerful level of I don't know, maturity of I don't know, jadedness, maturity, awareness, veteran. These things happen. They're going to happen again. There's going to be more victims. It's part of it. And it's true. Sometimes the activist WhatsApp group can get heated. Somebody will say something. Somebody really shares something really hurt them, and I think there's a lot of ability to hold that amongst people, amongst a lot of the people. And for me, there's a point when something happens like that, and you kind of want to blame. You want to blame. You see, this is what we're up to. This is what it feels like to be an Israeli. This is what it feels to be a Palestinian. And then there's another place where you move into, which I think is where the roots stems from a lot of the crisis. But this is the tragedy. This is the tragedy that we're all living, and we're here to stop that. I can let that emotion of blame or them or wanting to show the other side, but I know we've all seen so many times how it's been us being the ones who caused that pain. This time, so there's a place for me that the place that it goes to is that tragedy. Ali once said to me the right place for anger to develop to is sadness, to allow us just to feel sad about what happened. And it definitely helps if there wasn't Palestinians who I felt also feeling that sadness, it looks like the power's gone out, and vice versa, I think it'd be much harder. But that empathy is real. That place of empathy amongst the activists for each other is something, and is just something that's kind of built over time to hold those traumas. But it's true, definitely. The next day, if we're going to go speak to another pre-military academy tomorrow, they're coming with that in their hearts that day. And I think being aware it's important to be aware of the news cycle in that way. But food has a role. Did you want to answer?
Yes, plays a role in our work, and it comes basically in some activities that we do. For example, like we have one of our most popular activities is a joint break fast during the month of Ramadan, when Muslims are fasting, Palestinian Muslims are fasting. We basically do a joint break fast at the end of the day, where we invite families and people from our area, from Bethlehem, Gush Etzion, and Hebron, and many people out of roots actually come to this activity, and it's a chance for them to meet their neighbors, to meet someone on the other side, and to start learning about the work of roots and joining other roots activities. But not only that. Yeah.
And it's very important. We have traditional Palestinian dishes, foods, like for the break fast, and that's been very important for us. And all cooked kosher, oftentimes jointly cooked, doing the cooking together before. That's a place for food. I know our women's group before Corona was working on a joint cookbook, and then the Corona kind of got stopped. They kind of just started reconvening, so we'll see what happens. But those places of bridges are important, where you can. But also, I'll say that it's because of the political kind of context of where we're working. It's not always easy to just throw a cooking workshop. We have to pick sometimes with something with a little bit more meat, sometimes a little more meat and potatoes, as opposed to I think in other I think within the Green Line, when you have worked with Palestinian and Israeli citizens of Israel, you have a little more freedom to do kind of more cultural activities. With us, I think it's that constantly needing to kind of face up to the issues at stake. They need to be seen and addressed. Although also think with the youth program, like when our young adults spend a weekend together and they have to cook Shabbat together, that's also definitely, I think, a big part of the bonding of the Palestinians saying, wow, what is this crazy thing? We have to cook all the food before sundown. Why? What is this about? There's I think a lot of cultural learning that happened in there. And some people say that when we have better food at our events, more people come. I'm not sure. But,
would fit a pattern that exists in many places.
Yes, that's right. No, I don't think people, except for during Ramadan, and also during Tisha B'av. We'll say Tisha B'av, we'll say the 17th of Tammuz, we've offered the break fast. But that's then people do come
At the
to
end
faith.
of Jewish fast days.
Jewish fast
as
days,
well
yes.
as at the end of Ramadan. So there's another question that came in the chat, which I want to verbalize and then also ask a follow-up question to, which is, Doug Goldenberg observes that it seems the pattern that the US presidents attempting to do peace initiatives sort of leads to failures and then leads to violence. Is that what you observe? And I think you spoke to that a little bit, Shaul, about the ways that the peace process has not made lives better for either Israelis or Palestinians. I want to ask the follow-up question. It sounds like you do a lot of speaking to Israeli audiences, and I don't know how much speaking to Palestinian audiences as well, and I don't know how much to American Jewish audiences, but here we are an American Jewish audience. And is there a role that American Jews can play that is helpful in your work and not hindering? Besides donating to Roots, and I've put the donation link in the chat and I will do so again, but are there kinds of advocacy or educational work that you would ask of American Jews? And I'd love to ask Noor to answer the question first, if you're willing.
Yeah, sure. So violence coming as a result of a failure peace process or of attempts. I don't see the attempts or like the initiatives by U.S. presidents or by international powers in general to make peace between Israelis and Palestinians are wrong or affecting leaving negative impact. It's much more, for me, it's much more complicated than that. And why Oslo failed and what happened is much more deeper and like that. But what's the role that internationals can play and play in this conflict? First of all, I think that we Palestinians and Israelis, we cannot solve our conflict just our own selves. We definitely need help from outside to do so. But we also have to work on the ground. We have to do to continue doing the work that I'm talking about. Not just the work of politics, but the work of reconciliation. That's simply my conclusion to actually have peace. Otherwise, a peace here might happen as a result of pressure from outside and some sort of like a forced plan on both sides, maybe. That's how I see it happening. That's personally my opinion. And I don't think this is a really very successful approach because it won't really lead to sustainable peace. It will blow up again in our faces. So there is a lot of things you can do. And one of it is that the actions that's either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine are not really helping us anymore to move forward, but it became a way of increasing the conflict, actually supporting the conflict. When people are pro one side, they are doing it in a way against the other side, and that's helped actually to increase conflict more and not to help the two sides to come to a table and really go through a process that will help solving the conflict, understanding each other and solve the conflict. And I understand that politics work different from people work. I understand that very well. But I think that the internationals in general, the international role has should mediate Israeli-Palestinian relationships and the situation between us, and it should be the same distance. Like people who are engaging to mediate the conflict and help establish peace here should be on the same distance between Palestinians and Israelis. That's what I think. I think Jewish Americans can do a lot. I think by improving connections to Palestinians specifically and especially the US, and also enlarged to like Arabs and Muslims, building these bridges of understanding and dialogue with Palestinians there and Arabs and Muslims definitely is going to help us here in the region. These connections are going to help peacemakers here in the land. I've seen that myself. I've seen it as an activist of roots. I've seen it as a tour guide. And I've met people here on the ground who are Israelis and Palestinians who are working together. I've met American Jews and Palestinians in the US who are also working together to help us here on the ground. Also, like, you know, when people get the news, you know, try to get the news from different sources, really understand what's going on, both perspectives. I know it's hard, it's difficult, but it gives you a better understanding of the situation. So that's how I see it.
I'll just the points I'd add on to Doug. I think what this and one thing American attempts to make peace are always following American policy. There's very little altruism in foreign policy. You know, it's really serving interests, and I think that's something needs to recognize. I think, and the other thing that kind of Noor touched on a little bit is just that the sometimes how out of touch those initiatives. You know, they come seemingly more connected to American presidential cycles than to what's actually going on here. So sometimes there's kind of an abrasiveness, you know, like that I think that they're coming out of a different reading of what's going on. And I think that the need to match the political work with the grassroots, with the societal work is really critical, you know. And I think sometimes the American Peace Initiative and other initiatives also have suffered because they didn't read the cycles going on here on the ground. About what American Jewry is, what the place is, I think one is giving voice. I think what it seems like, you know, it's become such a like many things now, it's become such a polarized discourse of Israel, Palestine, like the pro this, pro that, and it's tied into all these myriad other issues. There's a real lack of a way to, I think, sharing nuanced voices is something that's important. I think sharing that there's actually Israelis and Palestinians very seriously working on the conflict from within Israeli and Palestinian society. People think it's like, oh, you have to wipe out Israel, you have to wipe out Palestine. That's the only way. And I think there is a big middle ground here that doesn't make the news cycle, doesn't make it, you know, that doesn't fit well into 30-second sound bites, and it gets missed. So I always say, you know, sharing about work like Roots or many other groups that are doing really serious work on the ground. I think that new political horizons are needed here. Noor and myself and many other people involved in Roots are also supporters of confederation models. You know, the political conversation's always been two states or one states, and they both have their good points and some serious missing points. There's an initiative called A Land for All. I should put them in the chat. That I think that's probably the most developed, politically worked out attempt at putting a new model of peace building here. And I think they need more voice. I think American Jewry is largely unaware of it. Starting to make a few kind of the very progressive podcasts, I think, are to find it. Not progressive, kind of really finger to the pulse, or hearing about it. I think that needs more voice. And I noticed it also. I think that the work of bridge building, Muslim Jewish work abroad, is also part of it. Just for helping the Muslim and the Arab world understand what the Jewish story is, and also for us understanding more what the Palestinian story is. I think those are things that can happen abroad. There's a giant Palestinian diaspora in North America, and they come, just like young Jewish people come visit, young Palestinians visit as well. And so there's definitely some connections to be made there.
Thank you both. And just to note, in response to Noor's comment about varying our news sources, Anita King asked, what are good sources for news? And Noor has made some answers, some suggestions in the chat. So Shaul, you can add your suggestions in the chat. And there's a very sweet question from Nadia. Are folks from the different Israeli-Palestinian efforts connected to one another? I assume to some extent, and I assume this question is also coming because what you just said, both of you, about varying your news sources, about increasing visibility of this, you know, less, the center that gains less attention of Israelis and Palestinians who are trying to coexist together. We heard something extremely similar from the folks at Standing Together last month, who were expressing very similar frustration. So I imagine Nadia's question may have to do with, you know, are you liaisoning with Standing Together? Are you liaising with Encounter? Are you liaising with the
Sure.
Tzedek? There's
there's, I mean, Roots is in a certain way, it's definitely kind of the black sheep of the peace camp. Okay, right. I'm a settler. I live in a settlement. Much of the peace camp is founded upon the premise of Oslo Peace Accords, in which the only thing I can do to make peace is to leave my home. And but there is not a small amount of peace organizations that for various reasons, some looking for a new political framework, some from acknowledging a one-state reality, others looking for conversions, and other from just the sense of people who are doing the work that we do work with. And groups like Women Wage Peace, which is I think about over 50,000 members in Israeli women involved, and is now a growing Palestinian network connected to them. Interfaith Encounter, the Siach Shalom, does some very I think very powerful work, very much behind the scenes with religious leadership on both sides. I'm blank. There's definitely a land for all. And there's a cadre of other organizations that we work, some of them fairly closely with, and are running programs together. Kind of on our website, there's a series we did during Corona. We did a series like almost a weekly Zoom presentation about, and we brought a lot of different organizations that we constantly work with, and some of them we might not work publicly with, but behind the scenes work, like Rabbis for Human Rights, for instance. Rabbis for Human Rights is a fairly staunch left-wing anti-settlement platform, but we've worked with them in connecting Palestinians who need support, harvesting their olives, going out to harvest olives together, feeding information back there, and using kind of back channels, and trying and even bringing representatives to speak in religious Zionist communities as a way of kind of opening these things. Sometimes it's tactically, just not the right move for either organization, but so you do things behind the scenes. Roots is a member of ALMEP, the Alliance for Middle East Peace, which is a conglomerate of about 120 different Israeli, Palestinian, and Jewish Arab groups working both in the Green Line, over Green Line, and in the region. So it's been important for us to be a part of that larger movement, and I think impacting the discourses there is something that's been a real part of the kind of maybe one of the functions of Roots. The two facilitators in our trauma therapy workshop have their own initiative. So there's we need to work together. It's definitely and like I said, sometimes you can cooperate publicly, sometimes it's behind the scenes, sometimes they don't. No, some people don't want to, on principle, will not talk to a settler. Okay, that's fine.
Well, I appreciate the answer, and I'm thinking about it's been almost a decade since I've been in Israel and Palestine, but I used to volunteer at Rabbis for Human Rights olive harvests, and the idea of settlers also participating in helping Palestinians harvest the olives and protecting them from attack sounds like an important tikkun, an important fixing that was not happening when I was last doing it about 10 years ago. So.
Yeah,
well,
there's some incredible ironies and absurdities that happen in this work. That's one of them.
Sure. Well, I want to acknowledge that it's now 11 p.m. in Israel, Palestine, and Noor and Shaul have stayed up very late to speak with us. I've just posted in the chat again the link to donate to Roots, as well as the link for if you're interested in seeing other recordings of programs they've done.
Thanks.
And so thank you both so much for your time. And I imagine if people want to ask follow-up questions, there are ways on the website to get questions directly, or if people want to route questions through me, that's fine as well. Just a note about this series to our participants, we are hosting one more of these events this fall, tail end of fall. On December 19th, we'll be meeting with the Parents Circle Families Forum. It's the third organization in this series, and folks are welcome to register for that. I will not be there because my sabbatical will have started, but Rabbi Eli of Temple Beth Shalom in Salem will be moderating that. So thank you to all who have attended, and thank you, Shaul and Noor, for putting yourselves out there in this work in general, as well as for taking this time to speak with us.
Thank you, Rabbi Uchi. Thank you for inviting us, and really feel free to follow. I put my email up there. Feel free to follow up, and and anybody who's really excited and wants to get more involved, we're happy with the community or individually. There's a Friends of Roots board in the US that's supporting their work, the 501c there, and there's some great people involved. It's so please feel the invitation. Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. And Noor, did you want to say anything else before we close?
Yeah, just thank you for listening to us, and I hope I can meet some of you here if you come here and visit. We'd love to meet you.
Inshallah, and can you hear us on?
Amen, amen.
May it be
Amen.
so.
Okay,
May
stay
this-
healthy, everybody.
May this crazy coronavirus
Yeah.
pass, and as we be able to connect in person someday.
Amen. Yeah, Rab. Bye. Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Morning.